Hello and welcome to this New Zealand Initiative webinar. My name is Oliver Hartwich. I'm the Executive Director here at the New Zealand Initiative, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all. And it's a special pleasure to welcome our two speakers today. We are launching James Kierstead's new report. It's called Unpopular Opinions, Academic Freedom in New Zealand, and it is just being released on our website. This report is the latest in a series of contributions James has made over the last couple of years on the state of our universities in New Zealand. And in particular, this report, of course, looks at academic freedom because we think there are good reasons to be concerned about the state of academic freedom at our tertiary institutions. I won't actually go too much into the content. I'll leave that all to James, but suffice to say that there are problems, of course, with our growing cancel culture, with the rise of managerialism and the influence of foreign governments in our tertiary sector. James has researched that over the last months and written a comprehensive report based on a lot of evidence and interviews and surveys. And this is probably the largest and the longest report we've ever published at the New Zealand Initiative, simply because there was so much material to cover. So the format of today is actually that James will present his report and discuss it. And then we are really grateful and privileged to have Professor Grant Schofield with us. Grant Schofield is the Professor of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity at AUT. We have invited him in that capacity, but actually today we have invited him mainly because he was so kind to write a foreword to the report, where he also shares some of his experiences with academic freedom in his professional career. The format for today is quite simple. As I said, we will hear from James, of course, first to get the gist of the report in about 10 minutes. Then we'll have Grant's comments on the report. And afterwards, we will open it up to a Q&A. And to participate in the Q&A, it's quite simple. You can all do it. You just have to log on to slido.com. You can see the Slido number behind James. It's easy, slido.com. You put in the number 304-4579, and you can ask your questions. And the best feature of Slido is also that you can see other people's questions, and you can vote on questions, and you can tell us which ones are the most burning, the most pressing, and I promise you I will ask them in the Q&A. There's no censorship here. And with that, I would invite James now to kick us off. I know you've got a PowerPoint presentation, so you might want to share your screen, James, and I'll hand over to you.
All right, thanks, Oliver. I'll just share my screen and I'll go into the PowerPoint. So hopefully you can all see that.
Yep. And I will put you on full screen. Yes.
All right. So as you know, our report is entitled Unpopular Opinions, Academic Freedom in New Zealand. And what I'm going to do now is just give you a very brief 10-minute overview of the project. So if you're unsure about anything I've said or you want more detail, rest assured there is plenty of further detail in the report, which is actually about 55,000 words long. As Oliver said, it's probably the longest report that the initiative has ever published, and I blame the universities entirely for keep on supplying me with more and more evidence of a poor climate for academic freedom. But today, as I've said, this is just an overview of the contents of the report. And what we'll start with, in fact, is an overview of the whole report in one slide. So in the introduction, we talk about why academic freedom is worth investigating and worth defending in the country. Next, we present 3 categories of evidence. First, there are the 71 testimonies we solicited from academics or from the Free Speech Union's 2023 survey, which included a section where academics could write about the climate for free expression at their institution in their own words. Then we discuss the results of 5 surveys that have been conducted on this topic in recent years by Heterodox New Zealand, which is a group of academics, by the Free Speech Union, by the University of Auckland, and by the Tertiary Education Union. After that is our catalogue of academic freedom incidents that have occurred over the past decade or so. So occasions in which academic freedom was either violated or seriously threatened, or which brought the issue into public consciousness in some way. In the next part of the report, we draw on this evidence to analyze what we take to be the 3 main threats to academic freedom in this country: radical progressivism and a pronounced political imbalance within universities, outside interference from the Chinese Communist Party, and managerialism and so-called neoliberalism, or university managers' tendency to see their universities first and foremost as brands to be protected. Finally, we make a few recommendations, although we've actually left the task of recommending legislation to the Free Speech Union, who are going to come out with a complementary report to this one. All right, so why is academic freedom important, and why should we be concerned about it in New Zealand today? Well, academic freedom enables students and academics to explore ideas, which underpins good teaching and good research. It allows them to develop their personalities and pursue their interests. and it allows them to exercise their autonomy without being shut down by those who are more powerful than them. It's an aspect of the freedom of expression that is already protected in the New Zealand Bill of Rights, and it's also specifically protected in the Education and Training Act, where it's defined partly as, and I quote, the freedom of academic staff and students within the law to question and test received wisdom, to put forward new ideas, and to state unpopular, controversial or unpopular opinions. New Zealand also, as it happens, has a proud legacy of protecting academic freedom. As some of you know, Karl Popper was able to write The Open Society and Its Enemies, one of the great defenses of liberal democracy, while a lecturer at what was then Canterbury College at the University of New Zealand. Popper actually lost no fewer than 16 family members in the Holocaust and would have been lucky to get away with his life had he stayed in his native Vienna. And he certainly wouldn't have been allowed to write a book that was critical of totalitarianisms of both the far left and the far right. So let's turn now to our first category of evidence, our testimonies from academics, all of which were anonymous. Only one academic agreed to put their name to a comment, but since they were the only ones, we actually removed it in the end so they wouldn't stick out too much. Some people did agree to give their own stories, which are separate. You can look those up in the report. They're slightly longer testimonies. All I can do here is just show you a very small selection of the testimonies in the report as a way of giving you some sense of what these testimonies are like. So we see on the screen, number 3, a New Zealand academic says, for several years, my colleagues and I have preferred to meet off campus for fear that anything we say, anything we find funny, anything we question might be used against us. And that is pretty typical. Number 23, I've included because it mentions non-disclosure agreements. Since we talked to a good number of academics or former academics who we heard were involved in academic freedom incidents, but who told us they couldn't say anymore because they'd signed a non-disclosure agreement. Number 25, questioning anything about the radical current interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi is likely to be career-ending. So that looks forward to something that the surveys told us, that the Treaty of Waitangi is actually the #1 issue that academics are afraid to just talk about in New Zealand. And then finally, number 41, very simple, there is a culture of fear in the university, in the New Zealand University. And that could stand really as a succinct summation of our whole report. Let's turn now to the surveys. We drew on 5 surveys in total, but we'll only have time here for some of the headline findings. So this first graph presents the main results of a survey conducted by Heterodox New Zealand, a group of academics of New Zealand undergraduates in 2022. So if you just focus on the gray columns initially, you'll see that between 20 and 40% of students felt uncomfortable sharing their views on each of these 4 topics in the classroom, depending on the topic. Now, Heterodox New Zealand is a chapter of a larger US-based organization called Heterodox Academy, and the researchers here used a version of the survey which Heterodox Academy had previously used in the US. So we can actually usefully compare the responses of New Zealand undergraduates to their US peers. And the US answers are the blue columns. Perhaps surprisingly, what we find is that a slightly higher proportion of New Zealand than American students felt uncomfortable discussing these issues. Second graph is from the Free Speech Union's 2022 survey of academics. And what we find here is that while only a small minority of respondents didn't feel free to criticize the government or engage in the research of their choice, those are the 2 bottom bars there, more substantial minorities, more than 40%, didn't feel free to question and test received wisdom, to raise differing perspectives, or debate and discuss issues around sex and gender. And fully half of respondents that year said they did not feel free to discuss issues around the Treaty of Waitangi and colonialism. And finally, our final category of evidence, which is our catalog of academic freedom incidents. Here again, we can't go into any of the incidents in any depth, but it might help if I tell you few of the sorts of incidents that feature in our list. So first and foremost are the classic deplatformings, such as the cancellation of Don Brash's talk at Massey, Daphne Whitmore's talk at AUT, and the cancellation of the Feminism 2020 conference, also at Massey. We also have a few examples of academics being investigated for things they have written. So Anne-Marie Brady, for example, for her report on links between New Zealand universities and the CCP, as well as 2 of the authors of the listener letter on science for that letter. We have petitions and calls by journalists for academics to be sacked, Rex Adar and Lauren Dutta, the 2 academics concerned in those cases. We have flyers or posters, both white nationalist flyers and also pro-Hong Kong independence flyers and posters being covered over or taken down. We have academics claiming they've been harassed, either by being burgled by the CCP in Anne-Marie Brady's case, or by extremists on social media in Susie Wiles' case. Finally, we have universities and scholarly institutions denouncing academics' views, something that we don't think constitutes a clear violation of academic freedom, but it arguably contributes to a chilling effect on free expression, and which happened both to Raymond Richards, who was then a history lecturer at Massey, and also the authors of the listener letter. So these are the three types of evidence that we've collected, and we hope this evidence can be of use to other researchers, even if they draw different conclusions than we do. But let's move on now to what we think the evidence can tell us about the three main threats to academic freedom in this country. So the first threat is progressive radicalism and the political imbalance that currently exists at our universities. So one aspect of this imbalance is shown in this graph, which again displays the results of Heterodox New Zealand's 2022 survey of undergraduates, but this time it has a breakdown by sex. If you ignore the US columns, so ignore the blue columns and just focus on the gray New Zealand ones, you'll see that right of center, ignore the ones on the left, I should say, the US columns on the left, and look at both the gray and the blue on the right. So you'll see there that right of center students are more likely to feel uncomfortable sharing their views on every one of those issues than left of center students do. Now, in other English-speaking countries, this pattern is associated with a numerical skew to the left in universities, with there being far more left of center than right of center academics. And the same may be the case here in New Zealand. That right of center academics feel more inhibited than their left of center peers is also not surprising if we consider the two issues that academics said they felt most afraid to broach: Treaty of Waitangi and sex or gender, both of which have become totemic issues for progressives in this country as in others. Finally, postmodernism seems to have a strong presence in some of the more progressive areas of New Zealand academia, in schools of education, for example. Obviously, it's part of academic freedom that academics should be able to explore these modes of analysis, but our evidence suggests that the emphasis that postmodernism places on speech as power and on the harm speech can cause can run counter to a more liberal and democratic notion of free speech and open debate. A second main threat is the Chinese state and the Communist Party that currently controls it. New Zealand universities are currently heavily dependent on China for research collaborations and students, with New Zealand second only to Australia in the number of international students per capita, and Chinese students making up our largest single category of international students. China features in several of our academic freedom incidents, including the cancellation of an event commemorating the Tiananmen Square massacre at AUT, Hong Kong independence flyers being covered over and a protester ending up on the ground at the University of Auckland, and Anne-Marie Brady being harassed, probably by CCP agents, and then investigated by her own university after publishing a report on links between New Zealand universities and China. New Zealand also seems to have been engaged with various Chinese academic programs that international researchers have raised concerns about, including the Thousand Talents Plan, the Chinese Scholarship Council scholarships, and Confucius Institutes. Our final threat is from the managerial and brand-focused nature of contemporary universities. Senior university administrators have sometimes themselves decided to deplatform speakers. The most glaring example of this being Massey Vice Chancellor Jan Thomas and her decision to cancel a talk that Don Brash had been slated to give to a student politics group. More junior administrators can also play a role, such as AUT's inclusion manager when Daphne Whitmore was deplatformed there. Many of our testimonies from academics also point towards managers, with one academic saying that there are themes decided at the university's senior team level, that are not for discussion, and another that universities are now neoliberal corporate entities which are much more focused on branding, compliance to values, and risk management. So finally, our recommendations. We do think that legislation might be necessary to bolster the Education Act in this regard, but as I've said, recommending legislation will be the task of the Free Speech Union's forthcoming report. We do make other recommendations in the report, however. One is that there should be an annual academic freedom audit of all our universities, including a survey of students, including postgraduates and academics, and a report on any academic freedom incidents that have occurred during the year. We also recommend training for university administrators, including vice chancellors, on their obligations to academic freedom under the Education Act. When it comes to China, we should be pragmatic, continuing to engage with one of the world's largest education markets, while also reviewing any programs that have links or that may have links to Chinese security. Finally, New Zealand universities should look at ways at weakening the power of overweening administrators, both by reducing the number of administrative positions and by restoring power to academics through university senates and the like. So none of these recommendations is going to be easy to implement, but if some of them or all of them are implemented, together with some sensible legislation, perhaps, New Zealand, we think, does have a chance to once again put itself on the map as a destination for academics looking for a place where academic freedom is taken for granted, as it was when Karl Popper came to New Zealand almost 90 years ago, and where scholars of many different persuasions and perspectives feel free to question and test received wisdom, to put forward new ideas, and to state controversial or unpopular opinions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, James. That was a great introduction to your report. And I recommend the report to everyone watching, and you can find it on our website at nzinitiative.org.nz. Just a reminder, the questions are coming in, and you can have your own question logged on slido.com. The quote is behind James, 304 4579. But now I invite the author of the foreword to this report, Grant Schofield, to give us your thoughts and your comments on James's report.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, thanks for inviting me to be part of this project, at least in the forward. And I really commend the report to all of you. You can grab it off the website. I've been lucky enough to have a couple of sneak previews of this over the last few weeks. It really is big. It really is comprehensive. And while there's a bunch of survey data of recent work and from both overseas as well as in New Zealand, perhaps the two most interesting things that stand out in my mind are the history of New Zealand in this regard, especially the story of Karl Popper. It's compelling. It's a legacy I think we're proud of in our universities at a time when the world didn't look like that. We were still part of the world that did operate in a way that we can be proud of. Our role as critic and conscious of society in universities, in my mind, has been eroded radically. And you can take what you like out of that word, but it has multiple meanings. In the last 20 years, but especially the last 10, and most especially the last 5. It also tells some stories by way of case studies of various things that have happened in New Zealand universities over the last little while. And there's really just a great deal of detail in those, and I think we can learn those. Those are instructive, but they also tell a story. And I particularly want to talk now about the listener 5, and I'll tell you why I want to talk about that in particular. But actually, why don't I start with that? So I've been an academic and a scientist for the last 35 years. It's interesting in my journey because it started in one place, has finished in another, and society's also changed over that time. So I started cutting my teeth as a postgraduate, then doctoral student in behavioral psychology. This is the really hard mathematical scientific end of psychology. I was working in a lab at the University of Auckland in the psychology department, and interesting at that time, 2 of my professors were Professor Mike Corbelis and now Professor, but then Dr. Doug Aliff, both members of the Listener 5 letter. And there was really, this was a discipline back then, as it still is now, because it didn't have a political view and its public advocacy work was relatively limited. That scientific debate and the scientific method as we understand it in a pure sense was really practiced to the letter. So you were required to defend your work. People would come after you and challenge you. And when new knowledge was created, the field would move. So that's how I understood the scientific process. I'm thrilled that I was able to cut my teeth in that category. But as life moved, and I moved to Australia for a decade, and they were pretty good in the 1990s at engaging in robust debate. They've moved a bit away from that now. I came back to New Zealand, and my field had now switched squarely into public health. And the full part of my area was physical activity and health. We had noticed, and the US Surgeon General had put out a report of this in the mid-90s, that we no longer moved in the way that we used to, and it was time for us to advocate and understand both scientifically and practically how we would do that. And the remarkable thing about that field is that we were really the first people in New Zealand to be studying that, and it was a new field really worldwide. Jerry Morris had done the London bus conductor study back in the 60s, but there hadn't been much in that field. And that was interesting to me as well, because scientific debate would happen there openly and freely without prejudice. It was a young field, and we weren't burdened by the opinions of the scientists that came before us that were wanting to hold on to our view. That interest transferred in more and more into public health and nutrition, as well as we started to try to understand obesity and how we had changed. And then things changed a lot, because there were many scientists that came before us that were very firm on their views. And that had been the way of science, really. You would have heard things from the physicists in the mid-20th century: science advances one funeral at a time. It's hard to change a scientist's view despite the knowledge of the scientific method. So these debates were rigorous and forthright, and I was really embroiled on those. It's not for the faint-hearted, but we were challenging the notion of dietary fat and heart disease, and perhaps sugar and starch were the primary cause. Eventually, that resulted in a letter being written led by the University of Otago, undersigned by the Heart Foundation in New Zealand, Diabetes New Zealand, the Cancer Society, and several other prominent academics, sent to my vice-chancellor, answering that I'd be sacked because of my contrary views. And I'm really proud to say my dean at the time and then vice-chancellor met constructively with me, and we decided that with their support that I should continue that work. We really tried to understand our role in critic and conscience of society and carry on from there. So that was through probably 15 years ago now, and that work's become more and more mainstream. And perhaps we've overcome some of the dissonance of some of those scientists, and that's been the continuing problem. Enter our latest stage of COVID, and then the algorithms that drive social media and the polarization of society, and a real shift in how the political left has done policy, has been a radical change in New Zealand universities and universities throughout the world. And I was firmly in public health, trying to raise the discussion about the time that we needed a balanced centrist discussion around evidence, around things we did, particularly around mandating medical procedures and where that fitted around legal frameworks and whatnot. And I was very quickly and swiftly told by my employer that needed to stop immediately, and that was not something we should be discussing within the university. So that was interesting. And then I suppose the latest stuff that I've noticed as we've started to get some research grants again, and I'm thinking particularly about one Health Research Council grant. This is a really highly experienced research team, both academically and clinically. Maori Pacific academics and clinicians working together for several years, and then the Health Research Council coming back and going, hey, there's these race issues that you need to address, and they seem so far outside of things. We initially refused, so they weren't going to give us the money, and perversely we've had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on aspects that had nothing to do with things that we couldn't defend in either public or private. And so I feel things have radically shifted in recent times and have adverse outcomes for the sorts of work we're trying to do rather than positive outcomes. So this report, I think, is centered around how much things have changed, yet we still have a legal framework that's robust. We still have a Education Act that's robust around this. Personally, I don't think there's a lot of discussion around this, and I suppose this is in the spirit of disagreeing. I don't necessarily feel we need a extra legal framework. We already have this in place, so far as I can tell. So I feel that everything's there. We just need to start behaving properly again. And in many ways, I think about this a little bit like North Korea. If the North Koreans all, or at least 50% of them, decided tomorrow that communism's over as it exists in North Korea, it'll be over. And if at least 50% of us in academia can decide that that academic free speech, operating robustly as radical centrists rather from the left or the right is a thing again, then it will be a thing immediately. And so that challenge also lies squarely with us beyond what we think about as the powers to be. So again, James, New Zealand Initiative, congratulations. I think this is a really comprehensive report. It's important, and I hope it raises the discussion and we don't get cancelled. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Grant. That was great, and that provides a lot of food for thought for our discussion. And just once again, reminder, you can ask your questions on Slido. I will try to ask the most popular questions first. And so we'll start with one from an anonymous viewer asking, to what extent has the postmodern assault on the concept of objective truth contributed to the current unfavorable climate for academic freedom? Who would like to take this?
I can have a go at that. I mean, yeah, I think we do write a bit about postmodernism in the report. I mean, it's tricky because it's such a sort of complex field or subfield to say exactly what's going on. But I think the problem with picking away at the idea of objective truth, to a certain extent, it makes sense. Everyone has their own perspective. But once you get to the stage where you're saying it's only the perspective that matters, then the point of view you have is really that everything's about power. And then a typical position in academia nowadays, which I've heard a lot, is we all have politics. We're all just driving our own agenda, but our agenda is more moral and better than yours, right? So it seems to kind of license this worldview where it's not about arbitrating disputes with reference to evidence or with, you know, how logical your argument is. It's really a sort of war of all against all, and that obviously isn't going to end in an environment in the university where people feel able to speak out and discuss things and draw attention to evidence.
Grant, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think if you're a postmodernist, go ahead, express your view. Just don't expect me to agree with you and possibly call you a hypocrite for when it comes to a medical procedure, because there is hopefully a cause and effect there that you can measure. That's, you know, that'd be awkward if there wasn't with something like surgery. So, you know, I'll think it's nonsense, appears nonsense to me, but I'm utterly and should be prepared to accept what you're thinking is your opinion and listen to what your points of view, and we can argue it out. I won't agree at the moment, but I might change my mind if we have a big enough debate.
Well, let's take the next question from Slido. And by the way, on Slido, you don't have to give your name. You can ask questions anonymously, but the next person has actually given his name. And it's nice to see that Jonathan Ailing, our friend from the Free Speech Union, is on the call. And he asks, does the recent treatment of free speech legislation in the UK make it more or less likely that meaningful law change will be achieved here in New Zealand?
Yeah, I don't know if it makes it more or less likely. What I will say on that front is I think that we have an opportunity, because
actually, James, if I could just interrupt, maybe just for the viewers actually who haven't heard about what happened in the UK recently, could you just summarize that briefly?
Okay, so this is the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, and that would have basically sort of given teeth to existing free speech legislation, and it would have set up a free speech czar, and would also have introduced a new tort, so a new type of civil wrong, so that if people had their free speech violated on English university campuses, there was a complaints procedure, but there was also a legal procedure, so they could effectively kind of take people to court for violating the free speech rights for deplatforming or whatever. So that was a bill that was put through by the previous Conservative government. Took them a long time, as these things take, and it was basically just going through as the last election happened. And very recently, the new Labour Education Secretary has signaled more or less clearly, I mean, all the commentators I've seen have interpreted this as her saying, we're going to rescind this measure, we're going to get rid of this act. And I think that would be a great shame for England. It's also a great shame for those of us who want to argue for similar legislation in New Zealand, because we now will probably not have an example of actual legislation like this working that we can point to and say, look, it's going well. But I also think that it's an opportunity, because as if Britain goes that way or England goes that way and America is still embroiled in all these problems with its universities, we actually have a big opportunity, because we're English speaking. There's a huge market for English speaking education, high quality education. And also I think there's a lot of thirst from people all over the world, but actually, especially perhaps in the English speaking world, who, you know, want to move to a university system where they know that free speech is actually going to be respected. So we don't have that many advantages, let's be honest, compared to sort of the great US or UK universities, or because of our position in the world, you know, our geographical location. But I think this is an opportunity to really steal a march on the English, on the Brits and the Americans and everybody else, because we can effectively just look at the education they would have used, which would have been, I think, great for England, and maybe take some version of that and apply it, and that'll signal very strongly to the rest of the world that we're open for business and we're open for sort of intellectual exchange.
Next question from our friend Ian Cooperus, and long-standing member, of course. Are any universities better than others on freedom of speech and, of course, academic freedom as well? And I think there are actually two questions in this. Ian might be asking about universities in New Zealand, but actually, what does the situation look like worldwide? Are there any universities for you that stand out when you compare ourselves internationally?
Well, first, so in New Zealand, I'm not sure if I've seen any universities when we did the research report that really stuck out as sort of being very good on the academic freedom front. I mean, possibly Auckland when Stuart McCutcheon was still the vice chancellor, because he kind of stood up for various things which were probably not sort of politically helpful to him, just for the principle of free speech. I would say that in terms of a few names of universities in New Zealand that have done an especially bad job, I mean, I would say Massey and AUT. And I think the Free Speech Union actually put out a report a few years ago where they scored universities on their freedom of speech. And I think the AUT came bottom. And I can see why. I mean, if you haven't seen the emails where they canceled the event organized by one of their lecturers, Jiwan, commemorating Tiananmen Square massacres, those are quite eye-opening. I mean, to be fair, the Vice Chancellor does say we defend the principle of freedom of speech, but it does seem that they're quite happy with the idea that they're canceling this event. They don't seem to reach out to the lecturer and try and reorganize it. So as I say, that's pretty eye-opening. AUT, that's AUT. So in Massey, with Massey, it's the Jan Thomas is the one. And again, the emails through OII there, if you read those, it's pretty clear that she goes into that with the intention of canceling that talk. And she immediately reaches out to you can read this on the OIO press, it's publicly available. She reaches out to the rest of her staff and says, what can we do around this? Do we have options to shut it down? So again, there is one, again, to be fair, there's one member of staff, one administrator who writes to her and says, we might not want to do this because people will complain that we're violating free speech. So technically that person does stand up for academic freedom, but it's obviously for pragmatic reasons, like they don't want to look bad rather than for the principle. So we think that, yeah, Massey isn't doing a great job on that front either. Internationally, I mean, it's a pretty awful situation, I think, internationally, especially with the sort of posture US universities. But just recently, there are signs that things could be turning around. I think, leadership is starting to sort of be more sensible about this. One thing that's changed a lot recently, I think, is that I think Harvard or maybe Princeton has decided to readopt institutional neutrality as a principle. So as I said in the presentation, it's not necessarily a violation of academic free speech for the university, for the institution to kind of denounce their views, but it definitely exerts a chilling effect, and they don't really need to do it. So that's a promising sign, but the American universities, especially the richer ones, they have a long way to go.
Just quick follow-up for you, James, and then I want to ask Grant. Is it an Anglo phenomenon? Is it something that really only affects or mainly affects English-speaking countries?
To be honest, I haven't looked into the evidence for non-English speaking countries closely enough, but my sense is that it's mostly an Anglophone phenomenon, yes.
Okay. And
I mean, obviously, I really need to add one more thing that people don't take that out of context. Obviously, it's the case that academic freedom in Russia, in North Korea, in communist China is a lot worse than here. So we need to, retain that perspective. But in the developed world, I think the English-speaking countries are kind of leading this erosion of academic freedom rights.
And Grant, since James singled out your employer, I think I have to ask him, you can fly the flag of AUT, but more broadly speaking, do you see any great differences between our universities?
Well, I'd always thought of Otago and then closely followed by Auckland, just probably because some of those cases have been higher profile as being the worst offenders. But frankly, I was encouraged by the statement from the University of Otago a few weeks ago around free speech, but a statement and action and freedom are probably two different things. So I remain somewhat encouraged by that. I think, they ask you what's like in the staff room or the common room and those sorts of things. Well, my experience is the discussions with your colleagues, especially your close colleagues that you've been working for a number of years with that are probably your friends as well, is a completely different thing. And so those are very free and open at work, and I think I generally have no problem with those, and I'm not worried about those. But as soon as it moves into a more formal meeting, the whole situation changes. And I mean, I'm scarred by my basic lack of self-control and stupidity, because I basically go to one of their staff meetings and go, okay, the only thing you have to do, Grant, for the next half an hour is say nothing. Just sit there and say nothing. And you know, there'll be 3 minutes and then I'll be launching back. So I don't feel particularly scared. And if I do, I'll carry on anyway. So, but, you know, I know a lot of my colleagues don't necessarily feel that way. They're more worried about risking their careers. I sort of feel I've been through a whole pretty good career. So, you know, if they want to make a martyr of me, then, you know, come on, let's have a go at it. And I've seemed to have survived that all right. So, you know, that's what I'm still saying, is that, you know, one level, there's still a mind shift on the academics part. You know, in many ways, bravery is carrying on anyway. When you're slightly scared, that's the whole definition of bravery. Of course, you're scared. So, you know, that's just my sort of personal 2 cents worth.
Got a question from our colleague Michael Johnston, and he already kind of implies the answer. He asks, do too many academics not even care about academic freedom? So I think we could probably ask the question differently. Do they care for it, and do they care enough, Grant?
Well, I think it really depends on your discipline, because when you're in, I don't know, biochemistry or, you know, organic chemistry and organic chemistry, and you're really close to science, and it's you know, linked to an actual public policy and those sorts of things, is it's important work, but it's pure science, then I don't think they really care about it at all. You're just engaging in your academic debate, and that'll probably continue relatively unabated. So free speech exists there. It's when you start to touch on political policy, and there's advocacy, and in my cases, there's you know, the pharmaceutical industry and the food industry and these sorts of things. That's where the problem starts. So I think you know, many people I hear say to me, well, you know, it's my job, I want to have a career, I want to be funded, and if I do this, I might not be. So I think they do care, but not as much as being employed.
Is that your experience too, James?
My experience is that academics do care a lot about free speech. Like a lot of it, we've talked about the sort of slant to the left. A lot of academics are, you know, reasonably robustly on the left, and they very much care about free speech. It's a huge value to them, and they'll talk about it and they'll fight for it if it is free speech from the left that's threatened by the right. So if it's threatened by the church, I mean, that's probably not going to happen these days, or if it's threatened by big business, then you have a big fight on your hands. And in fact, I remember when I was at Victoria University, I think it was 2017, the university came out with a new academic freedom draft policy, and it seemed sort of quite corporate. It's sort of trying to control what academics say, precisely because of concern for their brand. And academics push back very strongly against that. So it's not that they don't have the ideal, it's just that they suffer from a common human failing, which is this sort of partisan bias. They have a sort of blind spot around anything which is coming from the other side. So progressive intolerance is something that they don't even think about, because they think of themselves as being very tolerant. And I'm not saying they're, you know, it's unusual for humans to be like that. It's a kind of normal condition. But I think that's one of the big problems in this debate, and one of the reasons why, in some ways, it's easier to do this work from outside the university than inside, because, yeah, one of the main problems is this massive skew, and it actually means that academics can't see certain things which seem obvious to outsiders.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've touched already on the issue of the next question. That is about the Otago University statement regarding free speech. Question here is, has it noticeably impacted the environment at that institution? I suspect, I mean, this is only about a month ago, right? It might be too early to tell. Do you know anything else?
I don't. I mean, I've been in touch with various people who say it's a great idea and have been championing it. I don't think that anyone's felt a difference at Otago yet. And I think also I would add that a lot of people are saying it's great, like it's really good. This is almost a perfect kind of statement of free speech principles. But I think some people are a little bit distrustful that it's actually going to be implemented.
Okay. Next question. Kendall Clements asks, what, if anything, should be done about universities imposing compulsory courses on students that contain partisan, ideological, or political views?
That's a tough one. I mean, ideally, university courses would just contain content. Of course, it's a little bit debatable what consists in content and what consists in sort of ideology. But I would say one really important thing here that we actually recommend at the end of the report is that academics need to be in control of this material. So sometimes you get these sort of pushes from on high that we need to do this or that, and it has an ideological strain to it. And I think it's really important in these situations just to trust the actual academics to know what they're doing. I actually find in those situations, even though there's a big left-wing slant, if you get the academics to sort of think of themselves as first and foremost scientists or humanists or scholars, they're actually, they can be pretty good at actually just presenting the material. I still think, research gets distorted in a lot of cases, but I think you can trust academics to some extent with that sort of thing. And in those cases, sort of administrative interference actually from within the university, it tends to be more ideological than not.
That's difficult to define, isn't it? I mean, I'm thinking of the law, for example. There's a big discussion right now about the inclusion of tikanga into law. Now, you might say, well, this is what you have to study if you want to practice law in New Zealand. Others might see this as an ideological intrusion. It is a question of definition, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I will say is that things like that, so there are topics which are obviously the source of debate, like they're the subject of ongoing debate among academics. So for example, I think it was leaked recently at Auckland that they were considering doing cuts at the education faculty, and one of their criteria was about, I think, incorporation of Mataranga Maori. And they must have known that some people on the staff had publicly disagreed with that. So I think people were right to raise an alarm about that. So yeah, when something is, a major subject of contemporary debate within the field or within the country, I think it's important to sort of teach both sides to some extent. I mean, obviously people bring up things like creationism in science. There's some situations where it's clear that, one side has more evidence for it. But I think a lot of these other topics like Mataranga Maori and tikanga, I mean, that tikanga one isn't even a sort of evidence-based thing. It's more, how you look at the law. So that thing is that topic is very much in flux. And so I think it's quite sort of partisan to insist that academics teach it one way when you must know that there are lawyers and there are legal academics who don't think it should be incorporated, at least not as swiftly as some people want.
Any thoughts, Grant?
Well, I mean, I think I sort of thought this is Kendra would ask this type of thing. So this practical and a good question, because this is encroaching and people don't like it. And a really interesting example, I've got a young Ming Simming, a master's student from China, and his compulsory courses in intake bears really no relevance to the work he's doing or the cultural context in which he comes from, nor what he's going to go back to. So some ways the market will speak there and those guys will stop coming. So that's one thing. Another thing is then I'll be asked to have a Mataranga Maori lens on a course I'm running, which might be around insulin resistance and insulin's action on glucose transport. All I just go, so I can't think of a single thing that I could put in there, so I just don't. And no one seems to do anything because in that case I can't see how it's appropriate. So but there will be contexts where it is appropriate, and law may be one of those. I don't know. So I think on a case-by-case basis, I don't object to it on all principles, but I probably do object to it on first principles.
Question regarding the methodology of the report. How confident are you, James, of the multiple survey findings given the small samples?
I'm very confident in the sort of conjoint impression of all the 5 surveys. Some of the samples are pretty good. I think the TEU ones had surveys in sort of 2,000, maybe 3,000 in some cases. Heterodox Academy one was 750 or something like that. The first Free Speech Union one was 1,200. When people ask that question, I imagine they're thinking particularly of the 2023 Free Speech Union survey, which had a low response rate, very low response rate. But the Auckland internal survey basically came to the same conclusion, and it had the 67% response rate, so a very high response rate. So surveys always have limitations depending on the methodology and how many people you can get to answer them. And what we're trying to say in the report is just we lay out all this evidence, at all points in one direction.
And a bit of a related question from Thomas Newman. James, do you have any practical suggestions for how we might gather similar bodies of evidence about the environment in other professions, such as law?
Well, I mean, I think you could probably use some of the same techniques, surveys. I mean, surveys are difficult because, as I say, it's hard to get people to answer them. It's hard to get access to email lists. And I think one of the problems with the Free Speech Union survey in 2023 is that the email sort of bounced. It was blocked by some automatic anti-spam software. So I think ideally you'd have buy-in from kind of the powers that be to be able to kind of email everybody and get a reasonably good sample. But I think it is important to have some kind of mechanism whereby people can give feedback which is completely off the record that their bosses aren't going to know about. Because a lot of the testimonies that we saw in the Free Speech Union report are the ones that we solicited ourselves. I mean, as I said at the beginning, besides the separate sort of stories that some people put under their own name, mostly sort of retired or almost retired people, there was only one academic who said, I will put in a testimony under my own name. And in the end, we just thought, well, this is going to, if we just put her name, it's going to kind of expose her. Everybody else, initially I said, I would like testimonies under your own name. And basically, despite that, everyone was just like, please don't say who I am, which I think sort of tells its own story. So if you want to look into this, you need some kind of mechanism for getting people or reassuring people that they can speak off the record.
Oh.
And can I say something, Oliver,
Yes,
about that,
sure.
the survey? When the Free Speech Union put out their survey, I supported it with some positive comment, which of course straight away attached a couple of letters to my head of school and dean and vice chancellor around how ridiculous that was and how unscientific my comment was given the sample size. My response is it's a signal, but in the case of James's work, I think it's way more than a signal, because we're seeing, you know, across a range of different surveys, both nationally and internationally, and then through the more detailed case study description and other testimonies, sort of triangulation of evidence. And you know, it's only ever survey evidence, so it always has its limitations. But as we start to see the same signals again and again and again, you know, what's the chances of that signal being real or being an artifact of the people who chose to answer it? And I think it really falls squarely on the side that it's more likely to be a real signal. So I think it is a real thing. It's a serious thing. So no doubt someone else will write again and we'll defend it again.
Seems to be a bit of a pattern here. So it seems that in higher education, you need to be a distinguished professor to start speaking out in the same way that you need to be a really senior KC if you want to speak out against the Supreme Court. Question perhaps for you, Grant, because you've got such a long distinguished career in academia. Do you have a sense, any sense really, when this began and how long it's been going on, and when did it really start to get bad?
I think COVID, the social media lead-in before COVID, I mean, there was already books being written. I think The Coddling of the American Mind was an interesting one that, you know, spoke around this topic. So that was written, I think, in 2018, 2019. So that was a commentary on a world that had existed in the US at least over the last 4 or 5 years before that, and probably here as well. And then I think the way that we were able to act in a more totalitarian way, in a more sort of socialist state, where the truth is what the government said, really has shifted things for real. Whether we can come back from that is an interesting thing to me. I assume we can, but it would require some effort on that part.
Okay, so now we know roughly when it began, but there's another question, and that is asking us whether this is really something just for the universities. So the question is actually, why do you think is that hateful speech seems to be, similar findings would emerge, I'm sure, if a study was made across staff in almost any aspect of government, was the question here. So is this a phenomenon really that affects only you at universities, or is it something that you would see in practically every other walk of life these days?
It's not clear to me because I haven't really looked at all the evidence for this, but I suspect that you mentioned the rise of cancel culture initially. I mean, the Free Speech Union here was founded, and also in the UK, the original Free Speech Union was founded to fight that kind of thing. So it looks like there are at least lots of people who are concerned about a rise in censoriousness across the world, even outside of academia. I would suggest that, you know, academia is one of the main sort of centers for it. A lot of the ideas that lead to people being canceled in the rest of the world, they seem to come from this academic matrix. So these ideas about speech being harmful and speech being really a kind of tool of structural oppression rather than a way to explore ideas. So yeah, I think that probably the rates are still higher in academia, but this kind of thing has crept out into, this is just my suspicion, into the public service. Because I think one of the main mechanisms is just that people get these ideas at universities and then they go out into the world. So the places where you kind of find more university graduates are going to suffer from this kind of thing more.
Public service, media,
Yeah, probably media
HR
too.
departments.
Yeah, I think those are all examples, yeah. And who knows? I mean, maybe I'm sure that in some of the more conservative areas of the country, you probably have another type of small-mindedness. But I mean, my sense is that in my lifetime, you know, growing up in Western English-speaking countries, the narrative, the story we told ourselves is that these are places where you can have a political opinion and you won't get in trouble for it. It's a wonderful thing. And we can all get along and we can have different political views, different views on philosophy or even gender or history. And I'm not the only one, far from it, who feels that things have changed, you know, for the worse in the past few years, and that has something to do with the universities.
I think there's an interesting other layer on that, though, isn't there? Perhaps you know, I've been a public servant. I was a chief scientist in the Ministry of Education, and when you go there, you sign up to say, I'm not speaking freely. I'm enacting and helping with government policy despite my political and personal and scientific views. So, you know, that's why I'm terrible at that job, to be honest. So there is that, and you can't be working for British American Tobacco and sort of walking around going, look, you know, it's pretty obvious that smoking kills you, and my employer's wholly, you know, responsible for part of that picture in the world. You're not, you know, there's places where that doesn't happen despite your views. Whereas in academia, we are protected as a special role with that critic and conscious society and academic free speech. And they also bear quite a bit of responsibility because you know, you are required to have an up-to-date expertise and a broad set of thinking to engage in that debate. So I think, you know, there's special privileges and they have become especially eroded, but we need to work especially hard.
Okay. Next question then from an anonymous viewer. Why do you think it is that hateful speech seems to be more tolerated when it's left-leaning rather than right-leaning? How could that be combated?
I mean, I think I have an easy answer to that, which is just this massive skew that we've documented in the report. I mean, actually, we don't have very good figures for academic leaning in New Zealand. We have some impressions because one of the questions that the Free Speech Union asked in one of their surveys was, where do you come from politically? And it's skewed to the left, and we would speculate that sample was probably unusually kind of heterodox, centrist, or right-wing because they're taking the Free Speech Union survey. But we have really good figures for the UK and for Canada and for the US, and there's this massive leftward slant. And so even though I said a little bit about postmodernism, how that might play into this censorious atmosphere, I think in some ways it would be a surprise if you had this massive slant to one side and there wasn't a problem with free speech, just because a lot of psychological studies have shown over the past 50 or 60 or 70 years that humans have these tendencies to think in terms of a tribe. And if there's an outgroup, an other, as the more postmodern academics might say, we have a tendency to want to sort of marginalize the other and clamp down on them. And I think that that's something that you see at the universities today.
Okay. Next question from Simon Paris. How do we promote academic freedom given the norm of manner-enhancing behavior? Criticizing views in good faith can be seen ex post as manner trampling, of course, he says.
Yeah, so I'm not against manner enhancing. I'm not against respect and arguments. In fact, when I was an academic, I tried to sort of inculcate that in my students. But it's pretty clear that, like, not everyone is going to come out of a debate with their manner enhanced, because, you know, when I was a classicist, a Greek historian, you know, sometimes I would go to conferences and everyone would say, oh, great paper. And so, you know, once or twice I would go and someone would, senior professor at the back would put their hands up and say, but did you think about this? And I'd say, oh, actually, I didn't think about that. I didn't read that book, you know, and that wouldn't enhance my manner, but it was a necessary part of the process. And so I just think that these ideas of manner enhancing can be weaponized, right? If you lose an argument and you don't like it, do you want to take that out on somebody, you know? So I think that we need to find a way of talking about it where the university sort of encourages respectful disagreement, but with the understanding that sometimes things are going to be a bit rough. Not everyone is going to emerge from a debate with a smile on their face. But I mean, I don't want to make the university sound like a miserable place. I mean, you can do that and have, as Grant was saying earlier in his career, you know, earlier in my career as well, it was more like that. People had these robust discussions and arguments, and then you just move on. You wouldn't take it personally, and you actually enjoyed that. Maybe the next day it would be you who, you know, won a point in the debate or whatever.
Next question then. Is there a link or even some evidence to indicate this decline in academic freedom has damaged universities' brands and subsequently the number of enrollments. So questions really, if it's perceived to damage the standing of the university, who would still want to study there? And would they then choose quite deliberately some universities where it's different?
Yeah, I mean, that's my fear. That's my supposition. And that's also an opportunity for the universities to really get their house in order. I don't know of any direct evidence that that's the case, but certainly, I mean, I talk to students and other academics, and a lot of the students I talk to in New Zealand say to me, you know, I go to Vic because, you know, there's nowhere else that I would consider. I live in Wellington, whatever, for some reason like that. But they say that the atmosphere is very stifling and they wish it were otherwise. So the universities are kind of in a lucky situation in the fact that they have a lot of people in New Zealand who will probably just go to New Zealand universities. But if they want to be competing internationally, not only for students, but also for talented academics, a lot of whom are pretty free thinking, then they'll have to sort of put this right.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an interesting thing there, Oliver. I'll tell you a story. My oldest son did a degree in the department I work in, and you know, felt that, I think he said at the time that 50% of the courses were what he described as woke and unimaginative and useless in the real world, and had, you know, a lot of the stuff we're talking about. And a whole bunch of his friends came around doing the same degree, and I asked them all about this, and they're all saying more or less the same thing. You'd go to a departmental meeting on a review of the degree, and there wasn't a single discussion of any one of those things. I raised it, and I was virtually booed out of the room. So yeah, I think the universities really don't want to think about that, and so therefore we're not measuring that. But yeah, I 100% think that's probably a thing.
Well, not only that, I mean, I know a lot of academics who would say, who take the view, what we need to do in universities now is make them more focused on social justice. Mm-hmm. Seriously, because they live in this bubble. I mean, I'm not trying to be contemptuous because everyone lives in a bubble to some extent, but it's a very strong and noticeable dynamic on universities that it's all in one direction, and that makes people think, oh, everyone agrees with us, you know, and this is why it's important, I think, to get these surveys out and give people an opportunity to sort of say sotto voce what they really think.
Mm-hmm. Not a question, but a comment, which I'm going to read out anyway, because it confirms what we just talked about a minute ago. I'm a civil servant, and I see the same suppression of speech, thinking, and views, and this has real-world impacts on policy initiatives and public spending. So obviously not something limited to the universities. Next question is about ethnic groups. And the question is, individual ethnic groups have a wide variety of views. Extrapolating that premise into wider society, what learnings could be used to counter current trends?
I'm not sure what this question is getting at exactly. I mean, in the heterodox New Zealand survey, just to sort of focus on the evidence, we did ask sort of people by various groups about how they felt. And we also asked students to say who they thought would feel most uncomfortable in class discussions. And one interesting finding there was that those two parts of the question, those two sets of answers didn't always cohere. In other words, students weren't perfectly good. They weren't even that good at predicting which groups felt sort of more uncomfortable in classes. So for example, our survey evidence suggested that straight students felt more inhibited. And a lot of the students guessed that lesbian and gay students would feel more inhibited.
The way
so
I understood the question,
similar
James,
might be going on with ethnicity.
I think what was implied here is actually that these individual ethnic groups are not uniform. They have a wide variety of views. There is not one Chinese view and not one.
Oh, I see. Within each ethnic
So
group.
you will probably see that at university, that not every Chinese or every Maori student is the same. And actually, you could use the advantage.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, it's kind of a weird view to think that they're all going to think exactly the same, even though, you know, someone might have grown up in China or in Wellington, they both be Asian. I know people who think that, you know, it's sort of like a heuristic that ethnicities are, you know, probably going to have different views, but a lot of those things can be treacherous. And I mean, so another interesting thing about this is that people often attribute sort of radical left-wing views to minorities, even though if you actually study those minority groups and what they say their own views are. For example, Pacifica in New Zealand tend to be more religious. And a lot of the discourse about Pacifica that comes out of the university administration tends to be kind of radically leftist, especially on sexuality issues. So that's kind of an interesting disjuncture.
We do not censor any views here, but we have a hard time limit and we're running towards it. So in the last minute that we have, I would like to invite both of you just to briefly sum up your feelings about this report and actually what you would like to achieve with it. Maybe starting with you, James.
Well, I think it's a great report. It has a mountain of evidence.
Obviously, yes.
Wonderful report. I mean, I think that I'll just say, like, what we tried really hard to do was dispassionately collect the evidence and to give a sort of journalistic overview of a lot of these incidents. And that's what I'm most proud of. We spent a lot of time making sure we got everything correct, checking press reports, and also going to certain people who were involved and asking them what happened. So there's a mountain of evidence there. It's not something that you can just sort of wish away. If you're one of these people who think that there's no problem with academic freedom at all, there probably is. And I think this is the stage of the argument now where we have to think about solutions. And as I said, we did make some recommendations, but I personally think that more legislation is needed just to give the Education Act teeth and allow people to actually do something about this. But I'll leave that to Jonathan Ailing and the Free Speech Union, because they're going to be coming out with another report on this topic very soon, in which they will actually recommend legislation.
And Grant, will you dare tell your colleagues that you just spoke in the webinar on academic freedom?
Well, I suppose when you think about universities, like, you know, whether it's your students or your staff, I often think about a rough rule of thirds. So I think, you know, there's a third of people that are already thinking a lot about this, who are in academia. Academic freedom is important to them, and they would already take steps to support this, and this will be another, you know, further boost to them. There's a third in the middle that you know, could be persuaded to take this more seriously as an important part of their work, and I guess that's that group we're trying to influence and have them stand up for what they actually do believe in, but just need a nudge. So I think the work's really important for doing that. There's another third that, I mean, you can poke them with a sharp stick, who knows what will happen, probably nothing. So yeah, it's really that middle third, and I think, you know, that's really the importance of this work. It's a great collection of data, including the case studies and the survey research. And I just want to congratulate NZ Initiative and James for the work they've done.
Well, thank you very much. Then let's hope that we reach the right people with the report. Just a reminder, you can find the report on our website at nzinitiative.org.nz. But for now, that's the end of our discussion. And I would like to thank James Kierstead as the author of the report, and congratulations on the report, and Grant Schofield for being with us and discussing the thesis from the report. That's it for now. We look forward to seeing you next time, but thank you very much for today.